Welcome to the debate. When a bridge collapses, structural engineers, they don't sit around a conference table discussing the abstract culture of the steel.
Right. Yeah. They don't evaluate the good intentions of the concrete.
Exactly. They look at the structural load, the tension, and the mathematical failure of the architecture.
Because, well, physics doesn't care if you meant well. It really only cares if the system was actually built to hold the weight.
Which is exactly the point. But when a workplace collapses into, a pattern of harassment, for decades we've done the exact opposite of the engineers.
Yeah, we've talked about bad apples.
Bad apples, toxic environments, the good intentions of management. But that is all ending right now. We are currently navigating this massive, sweeping regulatory shift in the UK labor market.
Starting as of May 2026?
Right. Under the new Worker Protection Act and the Employment Rights Act of 2025, the legal burden on employers to prevent workplace sexual harassment has completely transformed. It's moved from this reactive, so-called reasonable steps defense.
Which often just meant, handing out a policy document on your first day.
Precisely. It's moved from that to a mandatory, proactive, all reasonable steps threshold.
Which is a massive escalation of the evidentiary burden. Like if an employer fails to actively prevent harassment, the consequences are incredibly severe now.
They really are. And today, we're looking at the corporate response to this new legal reality, specifically the adoption of the National Workplace Adjustments Framework, or NWAF.
Right.
And the core question we're debating today is this. Do mandatory engineered systems like the NWAF genuinely prevent harassment by removing human error from the equation? Or do they merely create an elaborate web of bureaucratic red tape designed entirely to shield corporations from liability?
It's the central tension of this whole regulatory shift.
Exactly. I will be arguing that this engineered governance is a necessary structural evolution that finally closes the loopholes of human discretion and shadow practices.
And I'll be arguing that turning your workplace culture into an automated, quote-unquote, evidence engine is profoundly dangerous. It really risks replacing genuine human accountability with a performative, audit-driven bureaucracy.
So let's actually look at why this shift happened in the first place. For too long, the old model of combating harassment was built on handbooks, vague cultural aspirations, and, maybe an annual mind-numbing PowerPoint presentation.
Usually a very boring one, yeah.
Right. And it was a profound failure. We have absolute proof of this failure in established case law. Take the tribunal case, Fisher v. London United Busways Ltd.
Oh, yes. A classic example.
It really is. That ruling perfectly illustrates the problem with relying on culture over structure. In that case, you had an employee who was subjected to repeated harassment. The company had a strict policy on the books.
They claimed to have a zero-tolerance attitude.
They did, but what actually happened? A local manager, using their own subjective human discretion, decided to handle the issue informally because the accused was, a longtime popular driver.
Yeah, they just brushed it under the rug.
Exactly. The tribunal ruled that having a zero-tolerance policy means absolutely nothing if it isn't consistently applied. A policy is just a slogan if a manager can simply choose not to enforce it because they're busy or the accused is their friend. We have to acknowledge human fallibility here.
I don't disagree that the old regime of static handbooks was a failure. It clearly was.
Right.
And the Fisher case is a textbook example of managerial cowardice. But I come at it from a different way when we look at the actual solution being presented here.
Okay, how so?
Well, the new focus on these engineered systems overly indexes on liability defense at the direct expense of genuine cultural transformation. Like when you look at the mechanics of this framework, what are the primary outputs it actually celebrates?
Verifiable data.
It prioritizes time-stamped evidence. It demands versioned documentation and decision logs. And why? Because the overarching goal isn't necessarily human dignity. The goal is to avoid the mandatory 25% compensation uplift.
Well, financial penalties drive compliance.
But for those unfamiliar, let me just clarify. Under the new law, if an employer loses at tribunal, the judge can slap an extra 25% onto the financial damages simply because the company didn't have proactive prevention systems in place.
Right, which forces them to act.
But the goal of these frameworks just becomes maintaining a perpetual audit-ready state to appease the new Fair Work Agency. When a company's primary focus becomes feeding an evidence engine, the system naturally produces bureaucratic red tape.
I think
It becomes a highly sophisticated box-ticking exercise. You aren't building a better workplace. You're building an incredibly robust shield to optimize for legal defensibility.
I see why you think that. But let me give you a different perspective. We cannot rely on ideals when people's actual safety is on the line.
But is an accounting solution really the answer to a moral problem?
I think characterizing it as an accounting solution really dismisses the mechanism of how we change human behavior. NWAF and similar architectures take that subjective manager discretion and replace it with predictable, nationally aligned assessment pathways. Let's look at the training dilemma as an example.
Okay, let's talk about training.
You mentioned the failure of the old handbook model. The NWAF tackled what behavioral psychologists call the forgetting curve of traditional training. We know that a one-time lecture results in rapid knowledge decay, right?
Sure, people forget things the second they leave the room.
Exactly. So to combat this, the framework mandates cognitive decay management, which is really just a formalized way of stopping people from forgetting what they learned through a scenario-based curriculum.
But it's still just a module.
It's not passive reading, though. It forces critical self-reflection through highly interactive tabletop exercises. Imagine an interactive simulation where a manager is presented with a scenario. Say, 2 employees are joking in a Slack channel and the tone shifts into hostile territory.
Okay.
The manager has to log exactly how they would intervene in real time. It models decision-making in realistic scenarios rather than just, reciting legal definitions.
But let's really interrogate what that looks like in practice. The framework relies heavily on these engineered refresh cycles to combat cognitive decay.
Which keeps the information fresh.
My question is, what are we actually measuring here? Does logging an employee's participation in an engineered refresh cycle truly measure a change in their moral behavior?
It measures their competence.
Or does it just prove that an employee on a random Tuesday afternoon knows how to click the correct multiple-choice answers in a digital simulation just to generate that required time-stamped verification log?
I wouldn't call it just clicking boxes. You're measuring their ability to navigate the software's expectations, not their underlying respect for their colleagues. I mean, it's a memory test masquerading as character development.
That's an interesting point, though I would definitely frame it differently. We aren't testing for the purity of their soul here. We are testing for baseline operational competence.
But is competence enough for a cultural issue?
Let's go back to the engineering mindset. Compare this engineered system to aviation safety checklists.
Okay, an aviation analogy.
Right. A pre-flight checklist does not teach a pilot how to fly an airplane. It doesn't grant the pilot a strong moral character or like a deep love of the sky.
No, of course not.
But it structurally prevents catastrophic, predictable errors that occur when even highly trained humans rely solely on their memory under pressure. A pilot might be tired or distracted and just forget to check the wing flaps. The checklist forces the behavior.
Sure. For a machine,
So isn't an engineered baseline of competence a structural reminder of exactly where the behavioral boundaries are objectively better than relying on the fleeting goodwill of an unprompted workforce?
that's a compelling argument, I'll admit. But have you considered the nature of the hazard in your analogy?
What do you mean?
Well, an airplane is a closed, mechanical system governed by physics. A workplace is a porous, dynamic ecosystem governed by human emotions, power dynamics, external pressures.
Well, there are still systems, though.
But a checklist works perfectly for setting wing flaps, because the wing flap doesn't have an ego, right? It doesn't harbor implicit bias. A checklist does not work for navigating the subtle, often insidious nuances of interpersonal coercion.
But the checklist provides a boundary.
When you reduce that deeply human dynamic to a tabletop exercise that just spits out a compliance score, you give organizations a false sense of security.
I don't think it's a false sense.
Think about it. The executive team points to the dashboard and says, "Look, we have 100% compliance on our cognitive decay modules," while the actual day-to-day culture on the sales floor remains deeply toxic.
I hear what you're saying about the risk of a false sense of security internally. But the dashboard is exactly what prevents the toxicity from hiding in the shadows. The framework demands that competence is verified and decisions are actually logged. Harassment.
Oh, the third-party mandate, yes.
We are talking about customers, clients, contractors, random visitors.
And this is exactly where the engineered system completely breaks down into pure bureaucracy. Like, if you're listening to this and thinking, wow, this sounds like an absolute nightmare for HR, you aren't alone.
It's a challenge, sure.
Think about sectors like construction or retail or healthcare. You cannot engineer the behavior of a random public citizen walking into a hospital emergency room in a state of crisis.
No one is saying you control the citizen.
You cannot engineer a delivery driver dropping off materials on a chaotic construction site. Yet, under this framework, employers are forced to create these risk-mapped environments and log exactly why certain steps were or weren't taken against these third parties.
Which proves they evaluated the risk.
But forcing a hospital administrator to generate a vast paper trail detailing their risk mapping of a patient yelling at a nurse, a situation they fundamentally do not control, is the literal definition of bureaucratic red tape. It's forcing companies to paper over chaos just to satisfy the all reasonable steps threshold.
They don't have to control the third party, though. They have to control their environment's response to the third party. And the framework provides highly specific, actionable solutions for this.
Like what, exactly?
Well, we're talking about contractual alignment, putting strict, non-negotiable conduct clauses into client engagement letters and contractor-vendor terms.
A clause and a contract, right.
And we're talking about visible, shared site rules and mandatory buddy systems for lone workers. These aren't just pieces of paper. They are structural boundaries placed around the employee to protect them from the unpredictable public.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why.
Okay.
Updating a client engagement letter to include a conduct declaration is a purely legalistic shield. Imagine a real scenario. It's 2 p.m. on a Tuesday, and a rogue plumbing contractor starts verbally harassing a young apprentice on a building site.
Okay, standard real-world issue.
The fact that there was a zero-tolerance clause hidden on page 4 of a vendor agreement signed 6 months ago does absolutely nothing to stop that harassment in the moment.
But it gives the site manager.
The buddy system might give the apprentice a witness, sure, but it doesn't fundamentally change the contractor's behavior. All that contract does is give the employer's legal counsel a piece of paper to wave at the employment tribunal later, saying, look, we took all reasonable steps, we had them sign the contract.
You're completely missing.
It protects the company's wallet. It does not protect the apprentice on the scaffolding.
But you're missing the mechanism of how that contract actually works in reality. It pre-authorizes protective action.
What do you mean by pre-authorizes?
In the old system, if that contractor harassed the apprentice, the site manager might hesitate. They might think, well, if I kick this plumbing crew off the site, we delay the build, we breach our contract, and I get fired.
So they do nothing.
Right. They do nothing, and the apprentice suffers. Under the engineered system, that conduct clause on page 4 means the site manager has absolute pre-authorized power to immediately expel the contractor without facing a breach of contract lawsuit. The paper trail enables swift, decisive action. Without that contractual alignment, the manager hesitates, the legal team gets involved, and the apprentice is left in danger while the company figures out its liability. The engineered system cuts through the hesitation.
It pre-authorizes the defense. Let's be honest about what the driving force is here.
I am being honest.
The penalty for failing this new duty is that massive 25% compensation uplift and unbounded legal costs, especially since the unfair dismissal compensation cap is removed post-January 2027.
Yes, the financial stakes are very high.
So the motivation driving these predictable protocols is entirely financial fear. When fear is the architect, the resulting building is a fortress, not a community. A fortress protects the king. It doesn't necessarily nurture the people living inside it.
I will gladly accept that fear of financial penalty as a motivator if it actually gets results. And let's connect that failure to stop rogue contractors to an even more critical internal issue.
Which is?
The failure to stop rogue leadership. This is where systems absolutely must step in to handle severe power dynamics. In April 2026, the law shifts to make sexual harassment a qualifying disclosure under whistleblowing law.
Right, treating it like corporate fraud.
Exactly. It's a massive escalation. It means that reporting harassment is now afforded the exact same ironclad legal armor as blowing the whistle on massive corporate fraud or a health and safety catastrophe.
which is a necessary, vital legal protection. Absolutely. I agree with that.
Right. And how does the NWAF handle this internally? Through its Leadership Hub and Governance Hub, which systematically strip away the most insidious corporate problem in history, the star employee loophole.
The rainmaker problem.
Exactly. Historically, if a top revenue generator or a senior executive was accused of harassment, there were shadow policies. Discretion allowed HR to look the other way, to settle quietly, to protect the rainmaker, because they brought in millions of pounds a year.
True. That happens constantly.
But under this engineered system, every single complaint requires a formal decision log recorded in the Governance Hub. It requires protected channels that bypass immediate line management. A high performer can no longer be shielded because the systemic requirement to log the decision removes the dark corners where those discretionary passes used to be handed out.
But we have to look at the artificial intelligence intersection that is rapidly approaching here.
AI? How does that change the logging requirement?
By August 2026, organizations will be expected to build evidence engines that generate predictive outputs without manual programming. As these systems scale, the Leadership Hub you're praising is highly likely to devolve into an automated compliance wall.
I don't see why it would devolve.
We risk a scenario where leadership accountability is reduced to an executive blindly, digitally signing off on algorithmically generated risk assessments just to appease the Equality and Human Rights Commission.
But they're still signing it.
They get an alert on their phone, they click Approve Risk Map, and they go back to their golf game. It becomes a performative pantomime of leadership facilitated by software rather than genuine ethical oversight.
Wait, I need to stop you there because I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning. You are completely missing the legal consequence of that exact signature.
Am I? It's just a digital signature.
That is the exact trap this system sets for the enabler. It's brilliant.
A trap. How is clicking Approve a trap?
Yes, even if a leader is acting entirely performatively, even if they are just blindly clicking Approve on a risk assessment on their phone without reading a single word of it, the structural requirement of that logged decision completely eliminates plausible deniability in court.
I see what you're saying. The red tape is the trap that catches the enabler. Think about it. In the past, a CEO could stand in front of a tribunal and say, I had no idea this was happening on the sales floor. My middle managers hid it from me.
Right, the ignorance defense.
Exactly. Under the engineered system, if they blindly sign off on a risk map that identifies the sales floor as high risk and they ignore a subsequent report, they cannot claim ignorance. They cannot blame a lower-level manager.
Because their name is on the log. The system forces them to put their name on the liability. The bureaucracy itself becomes the weapon for the victim. The engineered system doesn't require the executive to be a good person. It forces them to act like one under penalty of perjury and financial ruin.
But don't you see the profound tragedy in that?
Tragedy?
Listen to what you are saying. We're conceding that the only way to ensure human beings treat each other with basic dignity in the workplace is the explicit threat of an algorithmic audit and financial ruin.
If it works, it works.
But we are building systems that assume every manager is a potential liability, every interaction is a risk to be mapped, and every employee is a hazard to be mitigated. It drains the humanity out of human resources.
I think it protects the humans and human resources.
When the entire governance structure is oriented around proving to the Fair Work Agency that you didn't do anything technically wrong, you foster a culture of profound paranoia. You create an environment where managers are terrified to have authentic conversations, where every piece of feedback is filtered through a legal lens. That is not a culture of respect. That is a culture of fear.
I really don't see it as paranoia. I see it as structural integrity. Look, the transition to the May 2026 statutory duty is the most significant transformation of employment law in our lifetime, for a very good reason.
Because the old way failed, yes.
Vague intentions and human discretion have repeatedly, devastatingly failed the vulnerable. By mandating things like cognitive decay management to ensure people actually remember the rules, and by ruthlessly eliminating the shadow practices that protected star employees, systems like NWAF provide necessary, unshakable scaffolding.
Scaffolding that feels a lot like a cage.
Yes, it may feel administrative to the executives. It might feel like red tape. But this engineered system provides the predictable, consistent, and legally aligned defense that ensures workplace safety isn't just a corporate buzzword on a poster. It becomes a measurable, operational fact.
And I maintain the danger of equating a perfect time-stamped evidence engine with a genuinely healthy workplace. A company can have impeccable versioned documentation.
Sure.
They can have a perfect compliance score on their cognitive decay modules, and they can still be a miserable, coercive place to work, provided they are very good at filling out the decision logs.
Well, you can't engineer out every bad day.
When the penalty is a 25% compensation uplift and the threat of systemic investigation by the Fair Work Agency, the organization's true focus will always, inevitably, drift towards satisfying the audit, than seeing and supporting the actual human being standing right in front of them.
Regardless of our different perspectives on the actual mechanism, I think we've reached a clear point of convergence today.
I think we have.
The era of relying on vague intentions, static handbooks, and treating good culture as an adequate legal defense is definitively over. The regulatory landscape has shifted permanently, and employers can no longer hide behind ignorance or informal discretion.
Agreed entirely on that front. The reasonable steps defense of the past is gone, and organizations have to adapt or face severe, business-ending consequences.
Absolutely. It certainly invites a much deeper exploration into whether true accountability is best forged through the strict structural engineering of these new frameworks, or if we are losing a vital piece of human ethical engagement in the process of automating our morality.
It does indeed, which brings us back to where we started. If a bridge is failing, you don't ask the steel to try harder. You redesign the architecture.
Or you make sure you aren't building a fortress that crushes the people inside. The question that remains for our listeners is whether human behavior in the workplace is a force of nature that can be structurally engineered, or if in trying to mathematically prevent harassment, we are simply building a highly documented cage. Thank you for joining us on The Debate.